A black veteran with one leg stood in front of a judge, not to defend himself, but to defend a shelter for forgotten soldiers. The city called it illegal. He called it a promise. But when the courtroom turned against him, could his quiet stand still shake the system? If stories like this move, you don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and hit subscribe to follow more powerful stories from Mr. Mac's Stories. Now let's take you inside the courtroom where silence speaks louder than protest. The courtroom was too quiet for a Monday morning. The kind of quiet that didn't come from respect, just indifference. Like no one expected anything meaningful to happen here today. The door creaked open and a man stepped in. No one turned, no one stood. But if you looked close enough, you'd notice it wasn't an ordinary entrance. Calvin Briggs, 42 former staff sergeant, lost his right leg in Fallujah 12 years ago. He walked with no crutches, just a silent determination and a titanium prosthetic that clicked softly with each step, steady, unshaken. In his left hand, he carried a small bag. In his eyes, something heavier. He didn't wear a uniform, didn't need to. Some men don't need medals to be noticed. But that day in courtroom 2B, no one really looked. He made his way to the defense table and sat, no fuss, no sound. His suit was clean but worn, his presence quiet but firm, like a man who had learned that silence sometimes speaks louder than shouting. The charge against him was printed in black and white, obstruction of municipal enforcement. The real story. He refused to leave a condemned shelter housing dozens of homeless veterans, chained himself to a radiator pipe when the city came to clear it. No protest signs, no megaphone, just him and the men he refused to abandon. And now the court would decide whether that choice made him a criminal. At the bench sat Judge Eleanor Keene, 61, composed, razor sharp in the eyes, distant in the voice. She had seen hundreds of cases, thousands of faces. Hers was not a courtroom known for empathy. It was known for order, efficiency, closure. She glanced at Calvin for no more than a second. No raised eyebrow, no nod, no trace of recognition. Just a flicker in her gaze, the way someone might glance at a stranger who stepped somewhere they shouldn't. To her, he wasn't a soldier. He was a man who had broken protocol. She adjusted her robe and looked down at the docket. Calvin Briggs, she said flatly as though reading a file, not calling a name. Obstruction, civil disobedience. No plea entered yet. Defense counsel present. The air in the room stayed still. Even the ceiling fan above didn't hum. Calvin didn't look at her. He looked toward the back of the room, toward the empty seats meant for the public. Only a few were filled. One or two men in faded military jackets. A woman with graying hair and a small pin shaped like a folded flag. He took a quiet breath. They didn't see a threat. They saw a man who didn't walk away. But the question wasn't what they saw. It was what the court chose not to. People versus Calvin Briggs. The bailiff's voice echoed softly, cutting through the thin hush of the courtroom. Jordan Hale stood. Dark suit, clean lines, early 30s, polished. A man who knew his role, knew the rules, and knew how to keep everything measured, especially himself. He took one glance at the papers in front of him, then began. Your Honor, the city charges the defendant with unlawful occupation of a municipal property and interference with an official demolition order. On May 14th, Mr. Briggs refused to comply with direct orders to vacate a condemned shelter and remained on site well past the authorized deadline. He didn't look at Briggs as he spoke, just at the folder. Additionally, the defendant's presence appears to have influenced other individuals to delay evacuation, creating unsafe conditions for both workers and officers on site. The words were clean, neat, like the whole thing was just another zoning violation. Calvin sat still, his hands folded in front of him, not clenched, just calm. His attorney, Ray Wexler, shifted slightly in his seat, but didn't speak. Wexler had handled tough cases, angry clients, broken laws. But today felt different. Not louder, quieter. He kept his eyes on the judge. Judge Eleanor Keene glanced up from the docket. Her voice was clipped without decoration. Mr. Briggs. She said this is a court of law, not a therapy session, not a war memorial. Whatever you did overseas, however honorable, it does not exempt you from civilian responsibility. She leaned back slightly. This court doesn't weigh medals. It weighs actions. And you, sir, chose to ignore a direct and lawful order from the city. No emotion, no raised voice, just the kind of steady tone that comes from years of keeping things under control. Briggs didn't move, didn't answer. She tapped her pen once against the folder. You sat on a broken pipe in a condemned building, surrounded by exposed wiring, mold, instability. That's not courage, that's recklessness. Then she paused, looked directly at him, and added with the faintest curl at the edge of her mouth, "One leg or not, you really thought standing in front of a bulldozer was the right move." It wasn't loud, it wasn't shouted, but it cut. The room shifted not physically, but emotionally. Something in the gallery tightened. Even Hale blinked, unsure if that line was meant to be part of the record or just a passing thought. Wexler exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening just enough. He didn't speak, but his posture changed, leaned forward now, as if preparing for a storm that hadn't come yet. "Briggs!" He didn't blink, didn't flinch. He just looked at her, eyes steady, unshaken. Not angry, not defiant, just there, fully present, like he'd heard worse before and survived it. Keene held his stare for a moment, then looked away, brief but noticeable. And in that moment, the courtroom felt different. No words had been exchanged, no arguments made, but something invisible had shifted. A judge had struck first, but a man who'd faced real war hadn't moved an inch. The silence in the courtroom didn't break. It settled like fog hanging low over a quiet battlefield, present, unmoving, and strangely loud. No one said a word, but something had shifted. Then from the second row, a woman slowly rose to her feet. She was older, with silver hair pulled gently into a twist, the kind of elegance that doesn't ask to be noticed. Her blazer was modest, her hands folded in front of her like someone who had spent a lifetime holding more than they were ever able to say. But what caught the eye wasn't her poise, it was the small gold-edged pin on her lapel, a folded American flag. She didn't need to explain who she was. Mother of the Fallen said more than any outburst ever could. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just stood, her gaze steady on Calvin Briggs. A few rows back, a man in an old army jacket pushed himself up from the bench. His back was crooked, but his eyes were clear. His salute never came, but the posture of his silence was sharper than any uniform. Then another person stood, and another. No one said a word. No one asked others to join. But like ripples on still water, they rose one by one, drawn not by protest, but by recognition. Veterans, widows, people whose stories didn't make it into speeches. They weren't making a statement. They were acknowledging one. It wasn't loud, it was sacred. Judge Keene's lips thinned, her gavel resting inches from her hand. "I will not tolerate disruption," she warned, her voice sharper now. "This is a courtroom, not a public gallery. Anyone interfering with these proceedings will be escorted out." Still they stood. They weren't shouting. They weren't waving signs, but the silence they held, the kind that came from loss and service, and long memories, carried more weight than any argument the defense could make. Wexler glanced at Briggs, unsure if they should say something, if this moment would cost them more than it helped. But before he could speak, he felt a light pressure on his shoulder. Briggs, still seated, had reached out calmly, quietly. "Let me speak," he said, his voice barely above a whisper but firm enough to be heard. Wexler met his eyes, and in them he saw no anger, no fire, just the quiet steadiness of someone who had carried things far heavier than this moment and was ready now to carry it out loud. With deliberate motion, Briggs rose. He used no cane, no assistance, just the strength of his remaining leg, the balance of his titanium one, and the quiet gravity of everything he'd lived through. The courtroom didn't breathe, because in that moment, Calvin Briggs wasn't standing despite his missing leg. He was standing because of everything that had tried to keep him down and failed. The room had stilled. Every shuffle, every breath seemed to pause as Calvin Briggs took a single step forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't clear his throat. He just began speaking like someone who had held the words too long to waste them on anything but the truth. "I didn't come here to argue," he said, his voice low but steady. "And I'm not asking for sympathy." He looked toward the judge, not with defiance, but with something quieter, firmer. "I came here because the record's missing some things, and someone ought to speak them." He shifted his weight slightly, not because he was uncomfortable, but because even standing had meaning now. "I lost my leg in Sangin District 2012. It was a backwater village none of us could pronounce, in a war half the country had already forgotten." He paused, just long enough. "We were on convoy when we hit an IED. I was thrown into a ditch. Private Lewis, 19 years old from Little Rock, was still in the truck. The flames were coming fast, and command said we were to hold position until support arrived." He looked down for the first time, just a breath. "But I didn't wait. I went back in, dragged him out, took the hit with my leg before the second blast." No one moved. Even Judge Keene was silent now. "I didn't come back with glory," Briggs continued. "I came back with a prosthetic and 13 names I can still see when I close my eyes." He looked toward the gallery, toward the woman in the second row, toward the man with the old jacket, toward faces that remembered what many chose to forget. They were good men, better than me, and most of them didn't make it home. Another pause, not for effect, but for breath, for memory. Last week I went by the shelter the city had slated for demolition. I was looking for someone, honestly, and I found him. He swallowed. Private Lewis, the same kid I pulled from a burning truck 13 years ago, curled up behind a dumpster, shaking from cold and too proud to ask for help. He turned slightly, as if letting the room see the image he couldn't forget. No shoes, no family, just a half-eaten sandwich someone had tossed. His voice cracked slightly just once, then held. I've already lost men to a war we didn't start. I'm not about to lose them again to a country that's supposed to be home. His eyes returned to the judge, not pleading, not provoking. I didn't chain myself to a pipe because I wanted attention. I did it because, for the first time in years, someone needed me and no one else was coming. He let those words land, not heavy but honest. I didn't break the law to make a point. I stayed because it was right. Because Private Lewis didn't need a savior. He just needed to know someone still saw him. And just like that, he stepped back. No flourish, no nod, just quiet. The courtroom remained still, because what he said wasn't loud, but it echoed. There was a stillness in the room that no one dared break. Briggs had spoken his truth not to defend himself, but to defend the dignity of someone the city had forgotten. And for a moment, it felt like the silence might stretch forever. Then from the very back row, a man stood up. He wasn't in uniform. He wasn't wearing medals. He wore a plain dark suit, a white shirt, and shoes that looked a little too new, like he hadn't owned them long. His posture was careful, deliberate, like someone still getting used to standing straight again. All eyes turned. It took Briggs a second, but when he saw the face, a quiet warmth passed through his expression. Gentle, steady, almost like a father seeing a son return from something he wasn't sure he'd survive. The man nodded once, just enough. Judge Keene raised an eyebrow. Sir, are you here as part of the defense? Wexler turned to Briggs, but Briggs didn't look at the judge. He looked only at the young man and then said quietly for the whole courtroom to hear, "That's Private Lewis." You could feel the shift in the room, like a collective realization rolling through the air, subtle but undeniable. This wasn't just a name in a story. This was a man, flesh and blood, standing upright in the very courtroom that had dismissed him before it even knew he existed. Briggs stepped aside, not dramatically, just with grace. I didn't just pull him from a burning truck, he said. I pulled him from a freezing alley, from the edge of disappearing. He glanced at Lewis, then back at the judge. All it took was a warm bed, a meal that wasn't thrown away, and a door that didn't close in his face. The young man didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He just stood there, hands at his sides, chin lifted. But in his eyes, there was something no courtroom transcript could capture. Gratitude, quiet, fierce, unshakable. He met Briggs's gaze and held it. And though he said nothing, every person in that room felt what he was saying. I'm still here, because he saw me when no one else did. Wexler blinked once, as if trying to absorb the full weight of what had just shifted in their favor. Even Judge Keene seemed slower to respond this time, her fingers brushing the bench, but not reaching for the gavel. And Briggs, now standing just behind Lewis, didn't smile or gloat. He simply said, soft but sure, that shelter didn't just give him a bed. It gave him a reason to stand back up. The boy he saved had become the man who showed up. And that, in the end, said more than any defense ever could. The warmth that had briefly filled the courtroom after Lewis stood after Briggs spoke was fragile. And like most fragile things, it didn't last. Jordan Hale stood from the prosecution's table, his face unreadable. Your Honor, he said calmly, the city calls its next witness, Mr. Ricky Langston, Director of Municipal Property Oversight. There was a pause. Even Wexler furrowed his brows slightly. He hadn't seen that name on any prior list. From the hallway, a man in a gray blazer stepped in. Late 40s, clean-shaven, well-rehearsed. He walked with the confidence of someone used to meetings and memos, not war zones. But there was a quick glance toward Briggs as he passed, and in that glance something flickered. Regret, guilt. Maybe. He took the stand, was sworn in, and cleared his throat like he'd practiced. Mr. Langston Hale began. Can you explain your interaction with Mr. Briggs regarding the condemned shelter? Langston nodded. Yes, sir. I was present during multiple inspections. Mr. Briggs was repeatedly advised to vacate. He refused. In fact, he encouraged a group of homeless veterans to hold the building against city crews. He kept his voice calm, too calm. He said, and I quote, "If you won't protect us, we'll protect each other." A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Briggs didn't move. His face was stone, but his eyes locked on Langston. Hale pressed on. And did Mr. Briggs at any point act violently towards city staff? Langston hesitated just for half a second. Then yes, on May 14th during the standoff, one of our officers approached him to enforce the evacuation order. Mr. Briggs shoved him to the ground. We have the report. Keene straightened, her tone sharpened. Is this the first the court is hearing of an assault charge? Hale lifted a folder. Supplemental evidence, Your Honor. We received confirmation this morning. The city reserves the right to amend charges pending review. Wexler stood quickly. Objection ambush testimony with no cross-checking or independent witness. Sustained for now, Keene said. But let the record reflect the testimony. Briggs hadn't spoken. He hadn't even flinched. But something in his posture changed barely. Like a wall had shifted behind his ribs. He looked at Langston, and Langston couldn't quite meet his eyes. They had known each other. That much was clear now. Maybe not close, but enough for it to hurt. Wexler leaned toward Briggs, whispering, "Do you want me to press him?" But Briggs just shook his head. No, not yet. In the gallery, the older woman with the gold star pin tightened her jaw. The man in the army jacket looked away, as if ashamed not of Briggs, but of the game being played. Near the back of the courtroom, a woman sat typing rapidly into a laptop, Claire Sandoval, local journalist for the Times-Sentinel. She'd been quiet the whole time unnoticed, but now her fingers froze, then moved again, slower, more deliberate. Something didn't add up. She replayed Langston's quote in her head. The phrase didn't match what the city's previous statement had said in last month's press release. The timeline was too tight. She marked the discrepancy with a red flag. She didn't know if it would matter. But she knew this much truth didn't always shout. Sometimes it waited. And in that courtroom, something deeper than the testimony had started to crack. Judge Keene had spent decades behind that bench. She had heard the pleas of con artists and the silence of the truly broken. She'd built walls thick, clean, professional. Enough to do her job without letting the noise in. But no wall could brace for what came next. Ray Wexler stood. His voice was low, his tone unlike before. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to submit something into the record. Not as evidence, but as context. Keene raised an eyebrow, cautious. Wexler stepped forward carefully, holding a small white envelope yellowed slightly at the edges. The seal still intact. No stamps, no court markings. This was written 4 years ago, he said, by Lieutenant Matthew Keene. The air snapped inward like a held breath. Keene froze. The name hit her like a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding for years. Wexler didn't look at her directly. He set the envelope gently on the bench. Your son gave this letter to a grief counselor before he died. The counselor only recently contacted Mr. Briggs after seeing the story in the news. He paused, giving her space to object. She didn't. I understand this is irregular, and I leave it entirely to the court's discretion. Keene didn't speak. Her fingers, usually precise, hovered over the envelope as if it might burn her. Then she picked it up. She opened it slowly, her hands trembling, not from fear but from something older, something buried. The courtroom was still. Even the sounds of breath seemed distant. Her eyes moved across the page. No one could read what she saw, but something shifted in her posture. Her lips parted slightly, her shoulders, always squared, always still, dropped just a fraction. She blinked once, then again. Behind the lenses of her glasses, tears began to well. Not sudden, but steady, like water, finding its way through an old crack. She kept reading. And though the courtroom remained silent, everyone could feel that this wasn't a judge reviewing a note. This was a mother meeting a son again through the last words he left behind. In her lap, the page trembled lightly. From the gallery, no one dared move. Briggs watched her, not in triumph, not in expectation, just waiting. After a long minute, Keene placed the letter gently on the bench, pressing her hand over it like it was something sacred. No words left her mouth, but behind her glasses, a single tear traced the line of her cheek before she could wipe it away. The gavel sat untouched. The record stayed open, because some testimony doesn't come through witnesses. It comes through memory, through grief, through the echo of someone who never got to stand in a courtroom like this, but who left a voice behind anyway. And on that page, Matthew Keene had written, if you ever meet someone like me, don't treat them like they're broken. Don't treat them like a problem to solve or a disruption to control. Listen to them, Mom, please, just listen. Keene didn't speak, but something in her silence had changed. The silence that followed the letter lingered like incense, soft, heavy, sacred. Judge Keene didn't speak. She didn't need to. The lines around her eyes had softened, and in the deep stillness of that bench, She looked less like a symbol of power and more like a mother who had finally heard what she had long tried not to feel. Wexler turned to Briggs, ready to continue the defense. But Briggs shook his head. He didn't rise with urgency or anger. He stood slowly like someone who understood that what needed to be said didn't need to be shouted. He faced the judge, then the jury, then the crowd, and finally the prosecution. But he didn't make a speech. He simply asked with quiet clarity, if kindness is now a crime, then what's left of justice? His words didn't land like an argument. They landed like a truth someone had always known but never said out loud. Then from beside him, Lewis stepped forward. The same young man who'd once been curled behind a dumpster was now standing straight, shoulders back, voice clear. If helping a soldier stay alive is something we punish, now he said, then maybe we're not putting the right man on trial. His voice wasn't bitter, it wasn't angry, it was simply tired of hiding. He looked out at the courtroom not in search of approval, but in search of recognition. Not just for Briggs, but for every man like him who'd ever been left behind. And then the door at the back of the courtroom opened. No one turned at first, but Wexler saw it, so did a few others. A tall figure in a navy blue blazer with a silver lapel pin and polished shoes stepped forward. Admiral Victor Barnes, retired, decorated, respected across every military branch. He said nothing. He didn't walk to the stand. He didn't hand over a letter. He simply stood at the back straight as a flagpole and raised his hand in a crisp salute directed at Briggs. For a long, stunned second, no one moved. Then someone stood, then another, then a third, and in under 10 seconds, the entire gallery, Gold Star mothers, veterans, journalists, janitors, rose to their feet. No one gave the order. No one made a sound. But in that moment, they were all answering a question that hadn't been asked with words, but with a life lived in silence and in service. Keene's hands rested on the bench. Her voice didn't come immediately. When it did, it was softer, not weakened but human. Court will recess for deliberation. She stood not as an authority figure, but as someone who had heard something she could no longer unhear. And as Briggs sat down beside Wexler again, he didn't smile. But he did breathe. For the first time that day, maybe for the first time in years, it was a breath not taken in defense, but in peace. The doors opened slowly and all heads turned, not out of curiosity, but out of something closer to reverence. Judge Eleanor Keene walked back into the courtroom. She was composed but changed. Not weakened, not shaken, but softened in the way stone softens over time from weather not wear. In her hand, folded and refolded, was the letter from her son. The crease marks were deeper now. She took her seat, looked down, then looked up. The courtroom quieted. I've spent 32 years behind this bench, she began. Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried. And in all that time, I believed that justice was meant to stand firm, that it could not be swayed by emotion, that it must remain untouched like marble. She glanced down at the letter in her hand. Her thumb brushed the edge. But marble doesn't bend. It cracks. It shatters. And if justice cannot listen, then it's been blind for longer than we care to admit. She took a breath. I came into this courtroom expecting to weigh laws. What I found was a man who carried something far heavier than a statute. He carried our conscience. The room remained still, but the air had changed. You could feel it. She turned her gaze to Briggs. Mr. Briggs, this court acknowledges the technical violation remaining in a condemned building failing to comply with municipal orders. A pause. But this court also acknowledges something far greater. Her voice thickened just slightly, but she held her ground. You did not break the law to do harm. You broke a rule to preserve humanity. You did not act in contempt of this court. You acted in compassion for someone this system had forgotten. She folded her hands slowly. This court rule's violation is administrative, not criminal. No charges will proceed. No penalties assigned. Briggs didn't move, didn't smile. He just closed his eyes for a moment. Not in relief, but in release. Keene wasn't done. I will not use this gavel today, she said, resting her hand beside it. Because this verdict doesn't need the sound of wood striking wood. It needs the sound of us finally listening. Then quieter. Mr. Briggs doesn't need forgiveness. He needs recognition for holding on to something this courtroom, this city had nearly let go of. She rose from the bench, not hurried, not hesitant. She stepped down. And for the first time in her long career, she walked the short distance from her chair to the defendant's table. She stood before Calvin Briggs, and she extended her hand. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And in that moment, it wasn't a judge speaking to a defendant. It was a mother acknowledging a man who had carried her son's words when she hadn't been able to. And the entire courtroom, once a place of prosecution, became for one breathless moment a place of peace. A month passed, and where once there were bulldozers and boarded windows, now stood a hand-painted sign under soft morning light. The Briggs house, no one left behind. The shelter had been spared, not by decree, not by campaign, but by truth, quiet, undeniable truth. Inside, the chipped walls had been repainted. The floors still creaked, but now they creaked under footsteps of hope. In one room, Darnell Lewis sat at a table with two young veterans barely out of their teens. He wore no uniform, but they listened like he had earned every stripe imaginable. He wasn't just a counselor now. He was a reminder. Survival wasn't the end of the story, it was where healing began. Near the window, a girl, maybe 7, maybe 8, curled up with a donated book, lips mouthing words slowly, carefully. She'd been homeless just 6 months ago. Now her shoes were clean, and the window she read beside was hers for as long as she needed it. On the eastern wall hung a new frame. Inside was a photo, Lieutenant Matthew Keene in uniform, laughing carefree, caught in a rare moment of joy. Below the frame, a small plaque read, "He found peace here." It had arrived by mail, along with a short note in neat cursive. "If justice begins with listening, then let this be the place where it starts again, E. Keene." And on a quiet Thursday morning under a silver sky, Calvin Briggs stepped through the courthouse doors for the last time. The rain was soft, not enough to soak, just enough to remind you were still alive. Reporters waited. Cameras hovered. Someone shouted, "Mr. Briggs, do you have a statement?" He paused on the steps, the city stretching behind him. Then without hesitation, he said, "Dignity doesn't belong to those in power. It belongs to those who never stop standing, even on one leg." And with that, he walked into the rain, not as a defendant, not even as a hero, but as a man who had reminded an entire nation what justice could still look like when it finally found the courage to listen. This story wasn't just about a courtroom. It was about dignity, about the kind of quiet courage that doesn't make headlines but changes lives. Calvin Briggs didn't fight for a verdict. He stood for something deeper, that no one should be forgotten, and no act of kindness should ever be put on trial. If this story moved you, if it made you pause, reflect, or even tear up a little, please consider giving it a like and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're someone who believes in stories that speak to the heart, that lift up truth, justice, and the quiet strength of ordinary people, subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories. Every view, every comment, every share helps us keep creating stories that matter. Your support isn't just appreciated, it fuels our passion to keep going. Thanks for being here. We're honored to tell these stories for you. Now let's get ready for the next one.